The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a dull orange glow across the barren stretch of land. Dust drifted lazily through the air, carried by a dry wind that seemed to suck the life out of everything it touched. The earth was cracked, split into jagged patterns like a broken mirror. Not a single blade of grass dared to grow there. Even the birds avoided it, as if they too had decided the place wasn't worth their time. A group of men stood nearby, their boots pressed into the hard ground as they waited for the auction to begin. Most of them weren't serious buyers. They were there for the same reason people always showed up to these kinds of events: to watch, to judge, and to laugh. "Can't believe they're even trying to sell this," one man muttered, kicking at the dirt. His boot scraped across the surface without leaving much of a mark. "Sell," another scoffed. "They should be paying someone to take it." Laughter rippled through the group. At the center stood the auctioneer, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked just as doubtful as the rest. He flipped through his notes, then cleared his throat. "All right, gentlemen," he called out, forcing a professional tone. "Up for auction today, 40 acres of land. Starting bid at $100. Silence. Not even a whisper of interest. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably. $100 for 40 acres, he repeated, his voice slightly less confident. "Any takers?" A crow cawed in the distance, the only response. That's when a voice came from the back. $185. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned. Standing there, slightly apart from the others, was Daniel. He didn't look like much. His clothes were simple, worn from years of hard work. His hands were rough, marked with calluses and small scars. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but his eyes held something different. Focus. Determination. The crowd stared at him for a moment, and then burst into laughter. "Did he say $185? Someone chuckled. "He must be joking." "Hey, Daniel," one of the men shouted. "You planning to grow rocks out here?" More laughter followed. Daniel didn't react. He didn't argue. He didn't even smile. He simply stood there, waiting. The auctioneer blinked, surprised but relieved. "Do I hear any higher bids?" he asked quickly. No one spoke. Going once. Going twice. Sold for $185. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. And just like that, Daniel became the owner of 40 acres of what everyone believed was completely useless land. As the crowd began to disperse, a few men lingered, still amused. "You really think you can make something out of that?" one of them asked, crossing his arms. Daniel shrugged slightly. "I don't know yet." The man smirked. "Then why buy it?" Daniel paused, then replied quietly, "Because I know what I can do." The man frowned, not quite understanding. "Suit yourself," he said before walking away. The next morning, long before the sun rose, Daniel was already awake. His small house sat a few miles from the land. It wasn't much, just a single room with a bed, a table, and a few basic tools, but it was enough. He tied his boots, grabbed his shovel, and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying a faint hint of morning calm that would soon disappear under the heat of the day. By the time the first light touched the horizon, Daniel was standing on his land. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked. The ground was even harsher in the morning light. Cracks stretched endlessly, and the soil looked more like stone than earth. It was the kind of land that discouraged effort before it even began. But Daniel didn't feel discouraged. He had already decided something important. He wasn't here to see results. He was here to build a habit. He drove the shovel into the ground. It didn't go in easily. The metal struck the hard surface with a dull thud, barely breaking through. Daniel adjusted his stance and pushed harder. This time, the shovel dug a few inches in. That was enough. He started small. A single trench. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't deep. But it was a beginning. Hours passed as he worked steadily, his movements consistent and deliberate. Sweat dripped down his face, soaking into his shirt. His arms ached. His back protested. But he didn't stop. Not because it was easy, but because stopping wasn't part of the plan. The second day, he returned with buckets. Water was scarce in the area. The nearest reliable source was nearly a mile away. Most people would have seen that as a deal-breaker. Daniel saw it as part of the process. He carried bucket after bucket, pouring water into the shallow trenches he had dug. Much of it disappeared quickly into the dry soil, as if the ground itself was swallowing it whole. Still, he continued, bucket after bucket, step after step. By the end of the day, his shoulders burned from the effort. His hands were raw, but the trenches were damp. That mattered. The third day, he brought compost. For months before buying the land, Daniel had been collecting organic waste, leaves, food scraps, manure. People had laughed at him back then too, planning to build a mountain of trash. They had joked. Now, that trash became his most valuable resource. He spread it carefully into the trenches, mixing it with the soil, breaking up the hard ground bit by bit. It wasn't visible progress. From a distance, the land looked exactly the same. Dead, empty, pointless. Days turned into a routine. Wake up before sunrise, walk to the land, dig, carry water, mix compost, rest briefly, repeat. No variation, no shortcuts, just consistency. A week passed, then 2, then a month. The land didn't change, not in any obvious way. The cracks were still there. The dryness remained. If anything, it looked just as lifeless as before. The villagers noticed. Still at it, one man asked as he passed by. Daniel nodded. The man laughed. You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But you're wasting your time. Another added, even if something grows, it won't last. Daniel listened, but he didn't let their words take root. Because he understood something they didn't. Results are slow. Habits are immediate. Every day he showed up, he was winning, whether the land changed or not. There were moments, though, when doubt crept in. Late at night, when his body ached and his energy was gone, a quiet voice would whisper. What if they're right? What if nothing ever grows? What if this is all for nothing? Daniel didn't ignore the doubt. He acknowledged it. Then he made a simple decision. Even if nothing grows, I will still show up tomorrow. That decision changed everything, because it removed the pressure of results. He no longer needed proof. He only needed consistency. As the months went on, something subtle began to happen. The soil, once hard and unyielding, started to soften, just slightly. The water didn't disappear as quickly. The compost began to blend into the earth. It wasn't a visible transformation, but it was a real one. The land was changing beneath the surface. Just like Daniel. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel stood in the middle of his field, breathing heavily after another long day of work. A man approached him, the same one who had laughed at him during the auction. You're still here, the man said, almost surprised. Daniel nodded. The man looked around. I don't see anything different. Daniel smiled faintly. Not yet. The man shook his head. I don't get it. How do you keep going when nothing's happening? Daniel paused, then answered. Something is happening. You just can't see it yet. The man frowned, unsure what to make of that. But Daniel didn't explain further. Some things couldn't be understood from the outside. They had to be lived. That night, Daniel returned home, exhausted but steady. He sat down, drank a glass of water, and looked at his hands, blistered, rough, and tired. Then he smiled, because he knew something no one else did. The land wasn't dead, it was waiting, and so was the result of every single habit he had built. The next morning, before sunrise, Daniel woke up again. He put on his boots, picked up his shovel, and without hesitation, winter came quietly that year. The same land that had once been mocked as dead ground, now rested under a pale gray sky. The air was colder, sharper, and the wind carried a different kind of silence, not the lifeless silence from before, but one filled with anticipation. Daniel stood at the edge of his field, his hands tucked into his worn jacket. From a distance, it still didn't look like much. The soil had changed, yes, but there were no grand crops yet, no overflowing harvest, nothing that would silence his critics overnight. If anything, this was the hardest phase. Because now, he had done months of work, and still had almost nothing to show for it. Most people quit at this stage. Not at the beginning, when failure is expected. But in the middle, when effort feels invisible. Daniel felt it too. Each morning, when he stepped onto the land, a part of him hoped to see something new. A sign, a reward, even the smallest proof that all his effort was paying off. But most days, the ground looked the same. And yet, he continued. His routine never changed. Wake up before sunrise. Walk to the land. Check the soil. Carry water. Maintain the trenches. Plant, even when unsure. Repeat. There were days when his body resisted. Days when the cold made his hands stiff. Days when the wind burned his face. Days when exhaustion whispered, "Take a break." But Daniel had trained himself differently. He didn't ask, "Do I feel like it?" He asked, "What do I do every day?" And the answer was always the same. Work. One particularly cold morning, as frost clung to the edges of the soil, Daniel noticed something unusual. He almost missed it. Near one of the trenches, barely visible against the rough ground, was a tiny green sprout. So small it could have been overlooked. So fragile it could have been dismissed. But to Daniel, it was everything. He slowly knelt down, his eyes fixed on that single point of life. After months of nothing, something had finally grown. He didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't run to tell anyone. Instead, he sat there quietly, staring at it. Because he understood what it meant. It wasn't just a plant. It was proof. Proof that the land was changing. Proof that his habits were working. Proof that consistency, even without visible results, was never wasted. Daniel stood up, took a deep breath, and got back to work. From that day forward, his mindset shifted, not because the work became easier, but because his belief became stronger. Now, when he worked, he wasn't hoping anymore. He knew. Days passed, then weeks. More sprouts began to appear. At first, they were scattered, small patches of green breaking through the stubborn earth. Then they became more frequent. Where there had once been nothing, now there was life. The same villagers who had laughed before began to notice. "Have you seen Daniel's land?" one asked. "I heard something's actually growing there." "That's not possible." Curiosity replaced mockery. People started walking by more often, stopping to look, whispering among themselves. One afternoon, a small group gathered near the edge of Daniel's field. They watched as he worked, just as he always had, calm, focused, consistent. "Daniel," one of them called out, "what did you do differently?" Daniel paused, leaned on his shovel, and looked at them. "Nothing," he said. They exchanged confused glances. "Nothing," another repeated. "Then how is this happening?" Daniel smiled slightly. "I just didn't stop." As spring arrived, the transformation became undeniable. Rows of green stretched across the land. Crops began to take shape, rising steadily under the sun. The soil, once cracked and lifeless, now held moisture and richness. It wasn't just growth. It was abundance. The same land that no one wanted was now producing more than anyone expected. Farmers from nearby areas started visiting. They examined the soil. They studied the trenches. They asked questions, trying to understand the secret. "What fertilizer did you use? How often did you water? What seeds are these?" Daniel answered their questions, but many left disappointed. Because his answers weren't what they wanted to hear. "There's no trick," he would say. "No shortcut. Just daily work." Some believed him. Most didn't. A few farmers tried to copy him. They bought similar land. They used the same methods. They even followed his steps, for a while. But when results didn't come quickly, they stopped. That was the difference. They copied his actions, but not his habit. By the end of the year, Daniel's 40 acres had become one of the most productive farms in the region. Golden crops swayed in the wind. Healthy plants filled the fields. The air itself felt different, alive, vibrant, full. People no longer laughed when they spoke about him. Now, they spoke with respect. One evening, as the sun set over the thriving land, the same man who had mocked him at the auction approached again. This time, his tone was different. "I was wrong," he admitted. Daniel looked at him calmly. "About what?" The man gestured toward the fields. "About all of this. About you." Daniel nodded, not with pride, but with understanding. "It's okay," he said. The man hesitated, then asked, "Tell me honestly, when did you know this would work?" Daniel looked out across the land, thinking for a moment. "Not at the beginning," he said. "Not even in the middle." He paused, then added, "I knew it would work the day I decided I wouldn't quit." The man stood silently, letting those words sink in. Because deep down, he understood. It wasn't the land that had changed. It was Daniel's discipline. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Daniel walked slowly through his field. Each step reminded him of the journey. The early mornings, the exhaustion, the doubt, the silence, and most of all, the habit. He stopped near the place where the first sprout had appeared. It was no longer small or fragile. Now, it was strong, just like everything else around it. Daniel smiled, because he had proven something powerful, not just to others, but to himself. Great success is not built in one moment, it is built in small, repeated actions over time. When nothing seems to change, that is when habits matter most. People may laugh when they see no results. They may doubt your effort. But if you stay consistent, if you keep showing up every single day, then one day, quietly and suddenly, everything will change.